Hello, so today I'm going to introduce you to the After Effects animation software, which you will be using quite a bit from assignment 4 onward. So if you haven't already done so, go ahead and go to your Applications folder, and then within the Adobe After Effects 2020 folder, you will see the icon for Adobe After Effects 2020, and you can drag and drop that and bring it down to your dock, and it will live there whenever you start up your computer. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and fire up After Effects 2020, and while this is going, I'll talk a little bit about the software. So After Effects is a great software for 2D animation in particular. It does have some 3D animation capabilities, but most of what you will be working with in After Effects is 2D. So when you do start up After Effects, you'll probably get a window that looks like this. And we are going to start a new project, so I'm going to go ahead and click on the New Project button over by the left side of this pop-up window. If for any reason that doesn't pop up, you can always go File, New, and New Project this way. All right. So we're looking at the After Effects workspace, and it's pretty blank and non-descriptive right now. So I do want to get a couple of things in the project before we actually take a tour. But for now, I want you to go ahead and click on the New Composition icon that's right here. And if you don't see this option, I think you will, but if you don't, I can teach you another way to get that up there. So when you click on that new composition, you'll get a composition settings window, pop-up window, and composition name. Let's go ahead and just call this shapes. And the preset will be whatever is the default for After Effects, or whatever composition settings you had last time. And I was working in 4K, so that's why that is up. However, if you want to dial that down to your standard HD, you can choose one of these settings. You can also enter in the dimensions manually, so I can say for width, I could type in 1920 by 1080, which is my full HD. I'm able to choose my frame rate. Right now I'm going with this 23.976 because I consider it to be a little bit more cinematic, closer to sort of the old school celluloid frame rate of 24 frames per second. However, if you want even smoother animation, you can choose like a frame rate like 30 frames per second or something like this. However, because of the nature of this class and the fact that we're going to be creating GIFs for online, I really wouldn't go above 24 frames a second. The more frames you have, the larger the file size will be. So 23.976, 24, either one of those is fine. Probably 24. 23.976 is drop frame, which isn't really going to be an issue for what we're doing in this class. Okay, so the duration, right? Again, my duration is set for whatever project I was working in last in After Effects. I believe the default duration for After Effects is 30 seconds once you first start it. So the way that we change this duration, you can just click and highlight all the numbers. And rather than trying to navigate around these colons, I just go ahead and clear cut the whole thing, just select everything. And if I want a duration that is 5 seconds long, I just type in 500, right? 10 seconds would be 1,000. What if I want something that is, say, 4.5 seconds? Well, then I could do 412, right? Because half of 24, of course, is 12, right? So that's how that works. And then background color, the default background color is set to black. I usually add a background layer, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but I did want to show you how to change the background color if you ever want to do that. So we could have like a, let's say, a blue background color, and I'll just set that, it's royal blue. And, right, so here's my composition settings, the name, the preset, or the manual parameters that I typed in, frame rate, duration, and background color. And then I just click OK. So now it's a little easier for us to look at the interface for After Effects. So we'll start out here in the project window. So the project window can be found in the upper left corner of the After Effects workspace, right? And those of you who have worked in Adobe Premiere, the project panel in After Effects serves the same purpose as the project panel in Premiere, right? So this is where all your files will be stored. This is where all your compositions will be stored. And again, if you're familiar with Premiere, in Premiere, you're working with sequences, right? And each sequence contains a timeline. Well, in After Effects, the equivalent of the sequence, the Premiere sequence, is the composition. So you can also create more compositions. So you can have multiple compositions. You can create folders. Again, the Premiere Pro comparison to this is the bin. You can delete folders and so on. And then up here you can see whatever file or composition that you have selected, it will show you in this very top part of the project panel the statistics, the parameters for that item that you have selected. All right, well, let's go down here, and here we're looking at the timeline. So where I'm kind of hovering my cursor now, this is where you'll see all the file names or composition names that you drop into your composition. And then the clips themselves, the length of the clip and so on, will be over here in this part of the timeline. And then finally we have the composition window. So whatever you're playing in the timeline down here will show up here in the composition window. And then over here, we'll talk about this section later. This changes, but these are various panels that you can select and unselect by going to the window drop-down menu. And right now I have the character panel selected because the last project that I was working in had to deal with text. Maybe I'm not going to be working with text in this project that I'm working in, so I can uncheck that, and there it goes, right? But maybe I want to bring up something like the motion sketch tool, and there you can see it right now. So now we have the motion sketch panel, right? I can add effects panels and all this kind of thing. Also, it's good to know that there are different workspaces, different default workspaces, right? So I had been working in the text workspace, but yours might be set to the default workspace, and you can see I had a whole new crop of panels pop up here, right? But the main thing I want to communicate right now is that you can custom design this portion of the After Effects workspace depending on what tools you are using. All right, so let's look down here really quickly. I'm looking at the bottom of the composition window, right? So I'll just go left to right. And the first thing I want to talk about is the magnification ratio pop-up, right? So right now it's set to fit. You also have fit up to 200%. But the reason why mine says 92.6% is because it's basically fitting the window to, right? So here we go. If I kind of click and drag to make the composition window larger, you can see those numbers scrolling a bit, right? So it's fit to fill. But you can also set specific zoom ratios like 50%, right? So right now my window is 50%. I do like going ahead and going with the fit. All right, so resolution. This isn't going to be too much of an issue at first since we're going to just be working with shapes that we create in After Effects, but as you start working with larger files and specifically files that you bring in from Photoshop, bitmap, or raster files, and we'll talk about that later, your file size is going to be going up, which means the processing power that After Effects needs is going to be going up. And so your timeline, when you're viewing your animation, may not play at full speed. So maybe it's more important that you play at half speed or third speed or quarter or so on. I want to skip over to this toggle transparency grid. So you might remember that I created a background color when I was creating a composition, right? So that background color, we could say, is sort of a reference. It doesn't, it's something that, depending on how we export, the background color might not be there at all. We might have like a transparency. And this is why I also like to create my own background color layer. But I did want to show you, if you toggle transparency, you get this checkerboard. And essentially what this means is that it's like looking through a plate of glass, right? There's nothing here. It's completely transparent. I'll toggle that back on. Okay, so since the first assignment deals with geometric GIF animation, I do want to talk about some of the basics of using shapes, and we'll also talk about keyframes and creating keyframes and doing some very basic animation. So to create a shape, we'll go up here to here's the little tools panel, and right in the middle of the tools panel, you'll see the rectangle tool, right? So I'll just click on that. And as I click on the rectangle tool, I'll see over here in the options section, I have options for not only the fill color, which is this sort of slate blue, right? And if I want to change that to more dramatically contrast against my background, I can click on that fill swatch right there, and I can change the shape fill color, right? So now it's this kind of yellowish orange. If I click on the actual text that says fill, the blue text right there, I have fill options. So I could, if I want to, create a linear gradient or a radial gradient, or maybe I just want to have a shape that's an outline, in which case I would have no fill at all. Right? But for now, I'll just go with the solid color shape. Click OK. And the stroke, same thing. If I click on the stroke color, I can go over here to my shape stroke color and select a color that I like. I can also enter in either a hexadecimal code there or change the values through one of these ways. I'm not going to have any strokes, so I'm okay if I click on the stroke options. I'm okay having the none or the no stroke icon selected for that. All right, so once I have that, I'll go over to my canvas, and if I click and drag, right, you can see a rectangle or a square developing. Well, what happens if I want a perfectly shaped square? Now, maybe I want a rectangle, and this is fine, right? Like one of these. But if I want a perfectly shaped square, I press the Shift key, and you can see it kind of just snaps to a perfect square, and then I Shift click and drag, and it makes it larger or smaller, that kind of thing. All right, so I'll go back over to my selection tool, which is this little triangle here, or I can press V on my keyboard, which is the shortcut key for selection tool, and I could move that square around to reposition it. Now I want to go back for a second to this toggle transparency icon. So you can see there again at the bottom of the After Effects composition window. Right, so I toggle that on, and you can see once again that all this area that's not the square is transparent. So in After Effects, they would call this the information that is conveyed by the fact that this square is on a transparent layer. They would call that an alpha channel, right? So you have RGB, red, green, and blue channels that pertain to the colors of solid objects. And then they have this fourth channel called an alpha channel, which deals with transparency information, right? I'll toggle that back on. As I said, I always like to add a background color or photo, but in this case, a color. So the way I do that to add a background layer is I'll go up to Layer, New, and Solid. Layer, New, Solid, or Command Y. And I might choose a slightly different shade of blue or something else, just so we can kind of distinguish between maybe like a dark purple, just so we can distinguish between the background color that I specified for my composition and this new layer solid, right? So I'll click OK, and I'll retitle this in the solid settings pop-out menu. I will retitle that background. And for the size, it defaults to the size of the composition, right? So it's 1920 by 1080. If you wanted to use the layer solid for other reasons, maybe you were creating a lower thirds for a documentary, you could always change the dimensions of the layer solid. But I don't want to do that since I'm creating it as a background layer and I want it to fill the whole composition. So I just click OK. Okay, so where did my square go, right? So something else that I want to talk a little bit about is stacking order, right? So you can see my background, I'm in my timeline, by the way, and my background layer is above my shape layer, right? So that's something else to know about in After Effects, is that whatever layer is on top in the After Effects panel will be the layer that's on top in the composition window. So how do we switch these two? How do I get my square to be back on top? So I merely click and drag the background layer in the timeline so that it is now below, and there we see it, right? So there's the square again. Well, now if I look at the shape layer, the square, in the timeline, it says shape layer 1. Well, it's not very descriptive, especially, if I get 15 different shapes operating in this composition window. I don't want it to be shape layer 1, shape layer 2, etc. I want to be able to identify each of the layers more easily. So, to rename shape layer 1 so that it's something like yellow square, I simply click once on the shape layer 1 and I press return on my keyboard. And I'll call this yellow square. Now, there is a tendency, especially for those of you who are new to After Effects, to double click on a layer to rename it, right? And that's what we do in Photoshop. That's what you do in a lot of, if you want to rename a file, something like that. Or if you want to open a file, you might double click on it. Well, in After Effects, you can get into trouble if you double click on files. Right now, since we're working with shapes in After Effects, it's not an issue. But I might talk as we look at some of the other tutorials about what happens if you double click on a layer. It does not have the desired effect. So I've called this yellow square. I also want to let you know that you can actually change the color of the layer. So before we do that, though, I want you to look up here in the composition window, and you can see there's my yellow square, but then there's this little bounding box, right, that's specified by these little lavender colored squares, or anchor point looking things, right? So that corresponds, the color of those little squares corresponds to the color of my layer. Well, if it's yellow square, it makes sense that my yellow square layer would be yellow. Again, you don't have to do this, but I like to color code my layers. It just makes it a little bit more easy for me to keep track of everything, right? So there are those little bounding box squares again, and you can see that they've changed to yellow. As for my background, I might as well change that to purple. The other thing that I want to do with my background layer is I want to go ahead and lock it. I'm not going to move my background layer, so it can just stay in place and I don't need to deal with it. It's already there, and so I've locked it. So before we do any animation, I do want to talk about what we're looking at here in the center of the screen. This little yellow crosshairs. Before I changed the layer color of yellow square, it was lavender, right? Now it's yellow because this little crosshairs actually corresponds to my yellow square layer. And what this means in the practical sense is that if I were to rotate this square, notice how it's rotating around that little crosshair. And I'll talk about how I'm doing what I'm doing in a little bit, but mainly I just wanted to show you what this indicates. And what it indicates is it's kind of the anchor point or central point for this yellow square layer. So what if I didn't want the yellow square to rotate around this point, but I wanted it to rotate around the center of the square, right? So there's a way to switch the anchor point from here to the middle of the square, a couple of ways actually. But the way that I get it to align to exactly the center of the square is I'll go Layer, and so I'm in the Layers panel, or Layers drop-down menu, and I go Transform, and I center anchor point in layer content. So Layer, Transform, center anchor point in layer content. And there it is, right? So now, when I rotate the square, you can see that it's rotating around that central point. All right, so Before we get into dealing with the animation itself, I want to talk about our timeline. So those of you who are familiar with Premiere, you'll notice that the timeline in Premiere seems to go on forever. And actually, I think it goes on to about 10 hours and then it cuts off. I'm not sure exactly what that time is. But in After Effects, the timeline is only as long as our composition settings specify it to be. So we made sure and set the timeline for this composition to 5 seconds. And so our composition timeline is 5 seconds, and then it loops over, again and again, right? So you could always go up to composition and composition settings and change that if you wanted to. But we'll go ahead and leave it here. All right, so I want to talk about some of the different animation parameters in After Effects. So if I click on the little disclosure triangle or disclosure angle here to the left of the swatch, I get contents and transform. And contents pertains to the contents of the square itself, like the specific traits, attributes of the square itself, things like fill and stroke. And we'll talk about those a little bit more when we talk about the geometric GIF. But for now, go ahead and close that. And I want to focus on these transform parameters, right? Anchor point, position, scale, rotation, opacity. The anchor point we already talked a little bit about. Again, it's this central crosshairs, but I do want to go ahead and move down to the position parameter right here. And we'll go ahead and create an initial keyframe. So we're basically saying this is where I want the animation to start. So how do we create that keyframe? Well, I want to start at the beginning of my timeline, and you can see my playhead here. Now, if I want to go to the beginning of the timeline, I can either click and drag the playhead to the beginning of the timeline, or I can press the home key on my keyboard. Either one of those will get you to the beginning. And I can position my square where I want it. Maybe I want it off screen, right? Let's say that I want to have it off screen. So there it is. And you can still see the bounding box. So you still get a sense that the square is there. All right, so right to the left of the position text there's a little stopwatch icon, and I'm going to click that. And here we have now in my timeline, there's a little blue diamond shaped keyframe. You'll remember those are quite similar to the keyframes we saw in Photoshop. So now I'm going to either click and drag my playhead to the end of the timeline, or I can press end on my keyboard. Right? So I'm in a different place. My playhead is in a different place than it was when I created this initial keyframe. And with the playhead in a different place, I will click and drag my square somewhere else in the timeline. And maybe I want to drag it all the way off screen. Now you'll notice that I'm either kind of down or up. If I wanted to make sure that I was perfectly horizontal, I could press the Shift key on my keyboard. And now I think I let up too quickly on so let's try that again. So you got to up click on your mouse and then let go of the Shift key. And so what we're looking at now is this is a motion path, right? This little yellow chain that we see. You'll also notice that I now have a second keyframe. And After Effects automatically put that second keyframe there. So I don't need to click the stopwatch again. In fact, if I do click the stopwatch again, and don't do this, I'm just going to show you what happens when you do. Look at the keyframes in the timeline. they disappear, right? So we don't want to do that because we don't want to reset our keyframes. So just by the nature of taking your playhead somewhere else on the timeline and changing the position of that object on the timeline, it automatically, After Effects automatically lays down a keyframe. And you can tell that your shape has changed again through this motion path, this little yellow chain. So I'm going to press the space bar to play this back. And as I was saying, you can see this looping in motion. So while that's going on, I want to talk a little bit about this green line that we see at the bottom, or I'm sorry, at the top of our timeline here. And that refers to RAM preview, right? So After Effects needs to process the animation that's happening, which right now is actually very, very basic. So the RAM preview really isn't an issue. It's going to play this animation in real time. However, if I had 15 layers and some of them were raster graphics, again, these images that you photographs, this kind of thing, my RAM preview would take a little bit longer. It will not play the animation initially in real time until it RAM previews the animation. And in some cases, the file sizes of various layers are so large that you'll never be able to RAM preview completely your entire timeline in your composition. Okay, so we're almost there. I want to talk about a few more things, and then I think you'll be pretty well versed in creating some animation in After Effects. I'll go ahead and stop our timeline by pressing the space bar again. And I want you to look at our motion path. You'll see these little yellow circles that are a bit larger than the other circles. And these are called Bezier handles. And I can click and drag either up or down on those handles. And you can see there's like a little handle. I can actually draw it out further. I can push it in. And you can see how it's manipulating the curve. So I have this like sort of soft S curve here. All right, and you can see how that changes my animation. All right, really quickly, I'll just show you that we can, just as we change the position parameter, we can also change things like rotation. So again, this time I'll go to like 1 second actually. Let's say I don't want the rotation to begin until 1 second, right? So I click my stopwatch with my playhead at 1 second, and then I'll go to about 4 seconds, and I'll change the rotation parameter. Okay, so look at these little blue values right next to the rotation text. So the 0.0 degrees refers to how many degrees out of 360 I'm rotating the square. And as I click and drag on those blue numbers to change the value, you can see the square rotating in the timeline. All right. So if I were to play this back, you can see that there's a rotation that starts at 1 second and stops at 4 seconds. So let's go back to, I'm going to take my playhead back to 4 seconds, and I'll zero out the degrees. And let's look this time at the 0x. So that basically refers to how many times, right? So 0 times, if I typed in 1, I would get 1 full clockwise rotation, 1 360-degree clockwise rotation. If I type in minus 1 at 4 seconds, I get 1 complete. Oh, I have to change. So if you do the minus 1, you have to make sure that your rotation value for 1 second is 0 and for 4 seconds is minus 1. Right, so now we have a square that goes counterclockwise. All right, so needless to say, we can change the parameters for all sorts of things. Opacity, let's say. Maybe I want the square to fade out all the way at the end. So I change the opacity to 0 at the end and have it start at 100% at the beginning. All right, and then I won't add any animation for this last shape, but I am going to add another shape just to demonstrate layer stacking order. So this time I'll go to my rectangle tool once again, and I will select ellipse tool. If I click and hold on the rectangle tool, you can see I have these different options. Right, so there's my ellipse tool. And I can specify which color I would like my ellipse to be. Maybe I'll have it be a brighter shade of yellow, maybe even slightly green. And you want to make sure that none of your layers are selected, right? If I had my yellow square selected, it would actually create a greenish circle inside the yellow square layer. And I don't want to do that. I want to have my circle be completely independent, right? So I'm going to click and drag. And just like we did with the square versus rectangle, right? If I click and drag to hold, or if I shift click drag, I get a perfect circle, right? So remember, once again, we have shape layer 1 in the timeline. I might want to call this green, yellow, circle. And I can also change the color to, I guess yellow is kind of the closest maybe I'll change it to something else, maybe seafoam. That might be kind of the closest thing because just to differentiate it from our yellow square swatch, right? So you can also see a little bounding box that tells us about the layer boundaries for this green circle, yellow-green circle. So we won't do animation with that, but I did want to go ahead and click, again, I choose my selection tool here. I want to just click and drag the yellow circle over the yellow square. And you can see that the yellow circle is on top of the yellow square. And if I want to change that so the yellow square is on top, I'll click and drag. So what we get here now is we actually can see through we can actually see through the yellow square to the yellow circle. And remember, that's because we changed the opacity of the transparency of the yellow square. All right. So there is one more thing I want to show you, and that is we've talked about the different parameters for each of these shapes, right? Anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. But there might be a time where I just want to show, like if I'm not messing around with rotation or opacity, I might just want to make my visual a little bit more coherent for me. So maybe I just want to show the position parameter. So the way I do that is I select yellow square and I press P, and now we see position, right? If I wanted to just show the rotation, R, and there it is, there's rotation. If I just wanted to show the anchor point, and there's nothing on the anchor point, we didn't mess with that, but it would be A, S, again, we didn't mess with that, that would be S, right? So it's pretty straightforward until we get to opacity, which is actually T for transparency. That's the only one that's kind of counterintuitive. Finally, you could also press U on your keyboard, and it will show you any values where you've added keyframes. So for us, that's position, rotation, and opacity. If I clicked U for green, yellow circle, nothing would happen, right? Because I haven't adjusted any values. All right, so that is basic animation in After Effects, and I feel will provide you a pretty decent foundation for the assignment on the geometric GIF.